Welcome back to my channel, where we venture into the shadowy recesses of history to uncover its most disturbing narratives. I'm your guide, and in this episode, we're examining the eerie inheritance of a family whose customs defied not just the conventions of their society, but potentially the fundamental principles of existence itself. This is the account of the Halberts, a family who refused to inter their departed. A word of caution before we proceed. The narrative you're about to hear may cause considerable unease. The chronicle of the Halberts is not suited for those of a delicate disposition. So, lower your lights, secure your doors, and steel yourself for one of the most disquieting stories we've ever presented on this channel. The Halbert lineage first emerges from historical records in the isolated Highlands of Scotland during the latter part of the 1700s. The family patriarch, Magnus Halbert, was reputed to be an odd individual, withdrawn, severe, and harboring peculiar convictions regarding mortality and existence. They established themselves in the modest village of Blackmore, a place ensconced between rugged mountains and thick woodlands. It was a location perpetually cloaked in mist and mystery, where superstition ran as deep as the ancient roots of the towering pines that encircled it. Magnus had departed from Edinburgh with his wife Eleanor and their 3 children, William, Charlotte, and young Thomas, after a string of peculiar occurrences rendered them unwelcome in the city. The precise nature of what transpired in Edinburgh remains ambiguous, but rumors circulated that Magnus had been engaged in fringe scientific endeavors that had overstepped ethical boundaries. Upon settling in Blackmore, Magnus acquired a large estate on the periphery of the village. The manor house, an imposing edifice of dark stone with slender windows, was perched atop a hill overlooking the community. The villagers referred to it as Ravencrest Manor, though the Halberts simply called it home. It wasn't long before the locals started noticing the unusual behaviors of their new neighbors. The Halberts seldom came into the village, except for essential provisions. Despite the extent of their property, they enlisted no assistance from the local populace. Most notably, they were never observed participating in church services, a considerable departure from the social expectations of the period. Yet, these peculiarities were insignificant compared to what would later come to light. During the winter of 1798, misfortune befell the Halbert household when Eleanor was struck down by an enigmatic fever. The village physician, Dr. Sullivan, was summoned to Ravencrest. Upon his arrival, Magnus escorted him to Eleanor's bedchamber, where she lay pale and unmoving. "I'm concerned we may have arrived too late, Doctor," Magnus commented, his tone strangely flat. Dr. Sullivan examined Eleanor and confirmed what Magnus already understood. She had passed away. The doctor extended his sympathies and, following custom, started to talk about funeral preparations. "That will not be required," Magnus cut in, his voice sharp and conclusive. Bewildered, Dr. Sullivan insisted, underscoring the significance of a proper interment. "The Halberts do not bury their dead, Doctor," Magnus stated with unwavering conviction. "Eleanor will stay with her family, where she is meant to be." Disturbed yet uncertain how to react, Dr. Sullivan departed from Ravencrest that night, haunted by the peculiar exchange. The following day, he came back with the local minister, Reverend Clark, hoping to persuade Magnus of the necessity of a Christian burial. Upon their arrival, Magnus denied them entry. Through the slightly ajar door, the 2 men caught a sight that would torment them for the remainder of their lives. Eleanor's body, clothed in an elegant gown, was positioned at the dining table as though she were still alive, with the family assembled around her as if nothing had changed. Horrified, Reverend Clark insisted that Magnus demonstrate proper reverence for his wife's remains. Magnus' reply was chilling. "Death represents merely a change of state, Reverend. The body retains the spirit long after the heart ceases to beat. To inter her would be to permanently break that bond. We will not surrender her to the cold ground." News of this macabre situation disseminated rapidly through Blackmore. The villagers, previously cautious of the peculiar family on the hill, now regarded them with undisguised dread and mistrust. Certain individuals called for official intervention, while others were too terrified to even discuss the matter. Sheriff Douglas Mercer, the region's representative of law and order, visited Ravencrest to probe the disturbing allegations. When confronted, Magnus presented him with documents, old, yellowed pages inscribed with unusual symbols and antiquated phrasing. "This represents our family covenant," Magnus explained, "originating centuries ago. The Halberts have consistently kept their departed nearby. It constitutes our heritage, our entitlement." Sheriff Mercer, although profoundly unsettled, could identify no law that explicitly forbade a family from retaining a deceased relative within their residence, assuming no public health hazard existed. Reluctantly, he departed from Ravencrest without intervening, but cautioned Magnus that he would maintain close observation of the situation. As months elapsed, Eleanor's body continued to reside within the Halbert home. Visitors, the sparse few ever permitted entry, described encountering her in various rooms throughout the house. Her placement shifted regularly, as if she were still engaged in family activities. Sometimes positioned by the hearth with needlework in her inert hands, other times arranged at the piano, her stiff fingers resting on the keys. Even more disturbing were the accounts from those who claimed to have witnessed Magnus conversing with Eleanor's remains, seemingly convinced that some aspect of her could still perceive him. The children's responses to their mother's ongoing presence varied. William, the eldest at 16, appeared to have completely embraced his father's convictions, treating his mother's remains with the same respect he had shown her during her life. Charlotte, 13, was visibly troubled by the circumstances, yet remained compliant with her father's wishes. Young Thomas, only 8, was reported to ask visitors when his mother would awaken, indicating he hadn't fully grasped what had occurred. For 2 years, this unsettling arrangement continued, with Eleanor's preserved body maintaining a central role in the Halbert household. Magnus had evidently developed some preservation method that prevented typical decomposition, though the exact technique remained his closely guarded secret. Then, in the autumn of 1800, another calamity struck the family. William, while hunting in the thick forest surrounding Ravencrest, experienced a fatal accident when his rifle misfired. His body was transported back to the manor by his distraught father and siblings. Just as with Eleanor, William was not interred. Instead, his preserved body was integrated into the family's expanding display of mortality. Witnesses described William's corpse positioned in his preferred armchair in the library, a book eternally open in his rigid hands. By this stage, the villagers of Blackmoor had developed a complicated relationship with the Halberts. While most shunned the family entirely, considering their practices an outrage against God and nature, others became morbidly intrigued. Some even speculated that the Halberts had uncovered esoteric knowledge regarding death, that perhaps the family possessed understanding about the afterlife unavailable to others. These rumors gained momentum when people began reporting strange illuminations emanating from Ravencrest at unusual hours, accompanied by peculiar sounds that some characterized as unearthly incantations. More troubling were the accounts from shepherds who claimed to have observed figures moving across the Ravencrest grounds in the depths of night, figures that moved with an unnatural stiffness. Within the village, a minor cult of personality started to develop around Magnus Halbert. A handful of locals, attracted by the mystery and the hint of arcane wisdom, began visiting Ravencrest regularly. They returned with narratives that only enhanced the family's mystique, tales of Magnus performing strange rituals in the presence of his deceased wife and son, of ancient texts containing forgotten knowledge, and of experiments that challenged the very boundary between existence and death. One such visitor was Emily Sutton, a young woman who had recently lost her husband to consumption. Desperate to preserve some link to her beloved, she approached Magnus, hoping to learn his preservation techniques. Emily's account of her visit to Ravencrest provides one of the most comprehensive descriptions of the Halberts' unusual lifestyle. According to her journal, discovered years afterward, the interior of Ravencrest was unlike anything she had anticipated. "The manor is not a house of mourning," she wrote, "but rather a location where death and life coexist in disquieting harmony." The deceased Halberts are arranged throughout the home as if they were still engaged in daily activities. Eleanor with her needlework, William with his books. Magnus converses with them, sets places for them at the table, and treats them as if they were simply quiet, not absent. Most disturbing of all is the children's acceptance of this situation. Charlotte reads aloud to her mother's remains, while young Thomas plays at his brother's feet. They have normalized what should be impossible to accept. Emily characterized Magnus as charismatic and articulate, a man who discussed death not as an ending, but as a temporary inconvenience. He showed her his laboratory, a spacious chamber in the east wing of the manor filled with unusual equipment, containers of chemicals, and journals documenting his work. Magnus believes that the soul remains connected to the body considerably longer than conventional understanding suggests, Emily recorded. He speaks of death as a door that opens in both directions and intimates that under appropriate circumstances, that door might be reopened. Whether motivated by grief or genuinely persuaded by Magnus' theories, Emily became a frequent visitor to Ravencrest. She started assisting Magnus in his work, essentially becoming an apprentice. Her journal entries from this period become increasingly disjointed, filled with cryptic allusions to the threshold and the return. The situation at Ravencrest might have continued indefinitely if not for the events of the winter of 1803. An especially severe season had isolated Blackmore from neighboring towns for weeks. Food was scarce, and illness was spreading through the village. When 3 children from the village disappeared during a blizzard, search parties were organized. The missing children weren't found, but the search led to a shocking revelation on the grounds of Ravencrest. Behind the manor, partially hidden by the snow, searchers discovered a small building that hadn't been there before, a stone structure with no windows and a heavy iron door. From within came a foul odor and sounds that one searcher characterized as neither human nor animal, but something in between. Sheriff Mercer, leading the search party, demanded entry. When Magnus refused, the door was forced open. What they encountered inside defies simple explanation. The chamber contained several metal tables, each bearing a body in various stages of what can only be characterized as reconstruction. Body parts that seemed to belong to different individuals had been stitched together. Most horrifying of all, some of these composite forms exhibited signs of movement, twitching and jerking as if animated by some mysterious force. In one corner, barely identifiable as once having been human, were the remains of what the searchers believed to be the missing children. Magnus was immediately taken into custody, along with Emily Sutton, who was discovered assisting him. Charlotte and Thomas were placed in protective custody, both children appearing malnourished and in a condition of shock. Ravencrest was thoroughly searched. In addition to Eleanor and William's preserved bodies, the remains of at least 7 other individuals were discovered throughout the manor. All preserved through Magnus methods, and arranged as if they were still living inhabitants of the home. In Magnus' laboratory, authorities discovered journals detailing his experiments, his attempts to reverse death itself. The writings revealed a man obsessed with the concept that death wasn't final, that with the appropriate application of science and what he termed the old knowledge, the deceased could be restored. The trial of Magnus Halbert and Emily Sutton was brief and conducted away from public view. The specific charges were never entirely clarified in official records, perhaps because the nature of their crimes didn't fit existing legal categories. What is known is that both were found guilty and sentenced to death. The night before their scheduled execution, something occurred that has never been adequately explained. The jail where Magnus and Emily were being held was discovered empty in the morning. The cells were secured from the outside. The guards were at their positions, and no one had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. The prisoners had simply disappeared. A search of Ravencrest revealed that the preserved bodies of Eleanor and William had also vanished. The other bodies found in the manor remained, but the Halberts, both living and deceased, were gone without a trace. The most disturbing twist in this already macabre narrative came 3 days later, when a shepherd reported observing 5 figures moving across the moors in the early morning mist. A tall man, a woman, 2 children, and what appeared to be an adolescent boy. All 5 moved with the same stiff, unnatural gait. This was the final confirmed sighting of the Halbert family in Blackmoor. Ravencrest Manor was ultimately deserted, with no one willing to purchase or occupy a residence with such a grim history. Over time, the elements reclaimed the structure until only ruins remained as a testament to the family who had once lived, and perhaps never died, there. But the account of the Halberts didn't conclude with their disappearance from Blackmoor. Over the subsequent decades, reports emerged from various parts of Britain and later Europe of a strange family who never seemed to age and who were never seen burying their dead. In 1837, a physician in a small village in northern France documented his encounter with a family named Halford, who had recently relocated to the area. He was summoned to their home to attend to an elderly woman who had apparently experienced a stroke. Upon arriving, he discovered the woman clearly deceased. Yet the family refused to acknowledge her death, insisting she was merely in a deep sleep. The physician noted that other members of the family, particularly the patriarch, moved in an unusual manner, as if their joints had forgotten how to bend properly. When local authorities investigated, the family had disappeared, leaving behind only a strange chemical odor in their abandoned home. Similar accounts appeared throughout the 19th century in Germany, Austria, and as far east as Romania. The details varied, but common elements emerged: a family with an unusual fixation on preserving their dead, strange experiments conducted in secrecy, and an unnatural manner of movement among the family members. By the early 20th century, the story of the Halberts had become something of a legend among occultists and those interested in the macabre. Some claimed that Magnus had uncovered the secret of immortality, but at a terrible cost, a half-life of perpetual decay held at bay only through his mysterious preservation techniques. Others suggested that the Halberts had never been entirely human to begin with, that they were something older and stranger that had merely adopted human guise. The most credible later chapter in the Halbert saga came in 1923 when a private detective named Richard Thornton was engaged to investigate a reclusive family living in an isolated manor house in the Carpathian Mountains. His client, a wealthy businessman, had become concerned after his daughter became involved with the family's son. Thornton's detailed report, discovered among his effects after his death in 1927, describes a family of 5 who match descriptions of the Halberts in many respects. Most notably, he observed that while they claimed the elderly woman living with them was the family matriarch, she never spoke, never ate, and was frequently repositioned around the house like a piece of furniture. Thornton's investigation ended abruptly when he was discovered attempting to photograph the family. He was severely beaten and warned never to return. In his report, he wrote, "I cannot say with certainty that these are the infamous Halberts of Blackmoor, but if they are not, then they're their spiritual successors in every way that matters. They carry the same miasma of death postponed rather than conquered, of natural law defied, but not without consequence." The trail of the Halberts goes cold after Thornton's encounter. If they continued their nomadic existence throughout the 20th century, they apparently became more cautious about drawing attention to themselves. However, in 2006, an interesting discovery was made during the renovation of an old house in Prague. Hidden within a sealed wall cavity, workers found a collection of journals and scientific notes dating from the mid-19th century. The papers, written in an archaic form of English, detailed experiments in human preservation and animation that bore striking similarities to the methods attributed to Magnus Halbert. Most intriguing was a family photograph found among the papers. Though faded and damaged, it showed 5 figures: a stern-looking man, a woman with a vacant expression, 2 children, and a teenage boy. All were dressed in clothing from the late Victorian era, but the photograph itself appeared to have been taken much later, possibly in the 1930s or 1940s based on the photographic technique used. Experts who examined the photograph noted several disturbing details. The subject's skin had an unusual waxy appearance. Their postures were oddly rigid, even by the standards of early photography when subjects had to remain still for extended periods. Most telling was the woman's eyes, which appeared to be glass replacements rather than natural. The papers and photograph were acquired by a private collector before they could be properly studied by authorities, and their current whereabouts are unknown. In the decades since, rumors and unconfirmed sightings of the Halberts have continued to surface occasionally in obscure corners of the internet. Urban explorers claim to have encountered a strange family living in abandoned buildings. Hikers in remote areas report meeting a group of people who moved unnaturally and spoke in archaic English. Medical supply companies note unusual bulk orders of preservation chemicals delivered to abandoned addresses. None of these accounts can be verified, of course. The story of the Halberts, a family who refused to bury their dead and who may have discovered something terrible about the nature of death itself, remains primarily in the realm of legend. Yet, one has to wonder, if Magnus Halbert truly found a way to preserve not just the body, but something of the essence of a person after death, what would that mean for his family? Would they continue their macabre existence indefinitely, neither truly alive nor properly dead, moving from place to place as decades and eventually centuries passed? Would they continue to add to their family, preserving each member as they succumb to injury or illness or age, creating an ever-growing procession of the animated dead? And if they do still exist in some form, what would they look like now after more than 2 centuries of their unnatural existence? How much of their humanity would remain? These questions have fascinated and disturbed those who have studied the Halbert case over the years. Whatever the truth may be, the story of the family who never buried their dead serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of defying the natural order, of the fine line between devotion and obsession, and of the potentially terrible consequences of refusing to accept the finality of death. Before we conclude this dark chapter of history, I should note that while the story of the Halberts contains many verifiable elements, much of what we know comes from second-hand accounts, rumor, and folklore. The full truth of what occurred at Ravencrest Manor and what became of the family afterward may never be known with certainty. What we can say is that the legacy of the Halberts continues to cast a long shadow. In Blackmore, now a much larger town than it was in Magnus' day, locals still avoid the ruins of Ravencrest. Children dare each other to spend the night among the crumbling walls, but few are brave enough to accept the challenge. Those who do often return with wild tales of whispering voices and the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. The story has also inspired numerous works of fiction, from Victorian penny dreadfuls to modern horror films. The image of the family who keeps their dead as if they were still living has become a powerful motif in the Gothic tradition. Perhaps most unsettling are the periodic reports from around the world of families attempting to replicate the Halberts' practices. As recently as 2018, authorities in a small town in Eastern Europe discovered an elderly couple who had preserved the bodies of their deceased children and grandchildren, keeping them positioned throughout their home as if they were still alive. When questioned, the couple referenced the Halbert method and claimed to have learned it from a stranger who had visited their village years earlier. For those interested in exploring this story further, several academic works have attempted to separate fact from fiction in the Halbert case. Dr. Elizabeth Montgomery's The Thanatology of Magnus Halbert, Science, Superstition, and the Boundaries of Death provides perhaps the most thorough examination of the scientific principles that might have informed Magnus' preservation techniques. Professor James Harker's Ravencrest, A Study in Historical Horror, places the Halberts within the broader context of 19th-century attitudes toward death and mourning. Both works are available in our online shop, along with reproductions of some of the Halbert family documents that have survived to the present day. And now, as we close this chapter of the ghastly journal, I leave you with a final unsettling thought. What if the Halberts story isn't merely a historical curiosity or a cautionary tale? What if somewhere in the world a family of 5 continues their eternal procession through time, adding to their numbers as necessity dictates, never burying their dead because in some terrible way their dead have never truly died? If you're interested in supporting our channel and helping us continue to bring these obscure historical horrors to light, please consider becoming a patron. Your support allows us to delve deeper into the archives and uncover even more chilling tales from the shadows of history. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most macabre mysteries. Sleep well and remember, not all family traditions are meant to be preserved. But wait, before you go, there's one last detail I should share with you. During my research for this episode, I came across a curious listing on an obscure online marketplace specializing in antiques and historical artifacts. The item in question was a small leather-bound journal, allegedly belonging to Charlotte Halbert, dated 1847, nearly 50 years after the family's disappearance from Blackmore. The listing was removed within hours of being posted, and my attempts to contact the seller were unsuccessful. However, I was able to save the single page that had been photographed as part of the listing. The handwriting, analyzed by experts, appears consistent with early Victorian penmanship, and the paper and ink have been tentatively dated to the mid-19th century. The visible text reads as follows. Father says we must move again. The neighbors have begun to ask questions about Mother, why she never joins them for tea, why she is only ever seen through the windows. William caused trouble yesterday when he ventured into the village. His movements are becoming more erratic despite Father's best efforts. The new formula isn't working as well as the old one did. Thomas is the worst of us now. It has been almost 20 years since his accident, and Father's preservation techniques seem less effective with each passing year. The stitches across Thomas's neck have begun to show through the powder we used to conceal them. His left arm no longer moves at all. Father himself is changing. Sometimes I catch him staring at nothing. His eyes vacant, just like Mother's. I fear he has been taking the formula as well, though he is still breathing, still eating, still speaking of his great work. I alone remain as I was, though for how much longer I cannot say. Father has been watching me strangely these past weeks. I found him standing over my bed at night, syringe in hand, murmuring about preventative measures. Tomorrow we leave for America. Father believes we will find greater freedom there to continue his work. He speaks of vast empty spaces where we can exist without scrutiny. I am not sure I want to go. But then I'm not sure I have a choice anymore. I'm not sure I've had a choice since that winter night in 1803 when Father came to my room and told me it was time for me to help preserve our family legacy. Sometimes I dream of Blackmore, of a proper burial in consecrated ground, of rest. But such dreams are dangerous. Father always knows when I've had them. He says it means I'm slipping away and that soon I'll need his help to remain with the family. I fear that day is coming soon. My hands have begun to stiffen in the mornings. My reflection shows the same waxy pallor that William developed before his transition. Father has been preparing a special room for me in our new home across the ocean. If anyone finds this journal after I'm gone, or rather after I have changed, know that the Halberts still walk the earth, neither living nor dead. And if you should see a family of unusual stillness, their movements mechanical, their eyes never quite focusing on what they observe, run, and hope they have not noticed you. The authenticity of this document cannot be verified, of course. It may well be an elaborate hoax created by someone familiar with the Halbert legend. But if it is genuine, it provides a chilling glimpse into the continuation of the family's story long after they vanished from Scotland. And it raises another, perhaps even more disturbing possibility, that the Halberts not only preserved their dead, but that Magnus eventually began to preserve the living as well, administering his treatments to family members before natural death could claim them, creating a family suspended in some terrible state between life and death. The notion that the Halberts may have reached American shores is a new development in their story. If Charlotte's journal is to be believed, the family arrived in the United States sometime in the mid-19th century. This could explain the relative lack of reported sightings in Europe during the later Victorian era. American records from that period, particularly in frontier regions, were often sparse and unreliable. A strange family settling in a remote area might have escaped official documentation entirely. However, local folklore from various regions includes tales of the Stiff family or the Walking Dead folks that share certain similarities with the Halbert case. One such account comes from a small mining town in Colorado, circa 1870. According to local newspaper archives, a family named Halford purchased an abandoned mine and the surrounding property, converting part of the mine into what they called private research facilities. The family kept to themselves, but occasionally hired local men for specific tasks related to the renovation of the mine. One such worker, upon returning to town after several days at the Halford property, claimed to have seen something disturbing in a sealed section of the mine, what he described as people who ain't people no more, standing still as statues, but sometimes twitching like they're trying to remember how to move. The man was dismissed as drunk or delirious. But when a small group of townspeople went to investigate, they found the Halford property completely abandoned, with evidence of a hasty departure. In a hidden room cut into the rock, they discovered chemical equipment, journals written in code, and most disturbing of all, a collection of glass eyes of various colors, some still bearing traces of human tissue. Similar stories emerged in other isolated communities across America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A family in the bayou of Louisiana who were said to move like marionettes, a reclusive group in the mountains of West Virginia whose patriarch claimed to be a doctor specializing in life extension, a commune in the forests of the Pacific Northwest where visitors reported seeing people who appeared to be dead participating in daily activities. None of these accounts can be definitively linked to the Halberts. Yet, the pattern is suggestive. If Magnus and his family, both living and preserved, did come to America, they seem to have continued their nomadic existence, perhaps staying in each location only as long as they could avoid unwanted attention. The most recent chapter in this strange saga may be the most disturbing of all. In 2010, a fire at a remote farmhouse in rural Maine led to a grim discovery. After extinguishing the blaze, which had destroyed most of the structure, firefighters found a hidden cellar containing what was initially believed to be a mannequin workshop. Further investigation revealed that the mannequins were, in fact, human remains in various states of preservation. Most had been damaged in the fire, but forensic examination determined that some of the bodies had been preserved for decades, with the oldest potentially dating back to the early 20th century. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the more recently deceased individuals showed signs of having been artificially preserved while still alive. Evidence suggested that they had continued to move and function in some capacity for months or even years after the preservation process had begun. No residents of the farmhouse were ever found, either among the remains or elsewhere. The property had been purchased 20 years earlier by a cash buyer using what proved to be a false identity. Neighbors reported that the occupants kept to themselves and were rarely seen up close, though they occasionally observed what appeared to be a family of 5 through the windows, an older couple, 2 middle-aged individuals, and a younger person of indeterminate gender. Investigators noted that the farmhouse contained numerous books and journals related to obscure preservation techniques, experimental chemistry, and fringe theories about extending life beyond death. Among these materials was a family tree that, while partially burned, included the name Halbert near the top. DNA testing on the remains proved inconclusive, with analysts noting unusual chemical alterations to the cellular structure that prevented standard identification methods. The case remains open, classified as a multiple homicide with no named suspects. Could this be the final chapter in the Halberts saga? Did their centuries-long journey end in that fire in Maine? Or did they escape once again, perhaps leaving behind only their oldest and most deteriorated family members as they fled into the night? The truth may never be known. But perhaps that uncertainty is fitting for a family whose very existence challenged the boundary between life and death, between history and legend. What we can say with some confidence is that the story of the Halberts, whether viewed as historical fact, elaborated folklore, or cautionary tale, touches something primal in our collective psyche. It speaks to our fear of death, our reluctance to part with those we love, and the terrible consequences that might arise from defying the natural order. In a modern world where science continues to push the boundaries of what is possible, where cryonics promises to preserve our bodies for future revival, where transhumanists speak of uploading consciousness into machines to achieve a kind of immortality, perhaps the tale of the Halberts serves as a necessary warning. Some boundaries, it suggests, are not meant to be crossed. Some doors, once opened, cannot easily be closed again. And so we leave the Halberts to whatever fate ultimately claimed them, or to their continued wandering if they somehow endure. Their story remains a disturbing footnote in the annals of the macabre, a reminder that some family traditions are best left unpreserved. As for Magnus himself, the man who began this terrible legacy, perhaps he achieved exactly what he set out to accomplish, a family that would never be separated by death, that would remain together through the long centuries, unchanging even as the world transformed around them. Whether that represents triumph or tragedy depends, I suppose, on how one views the nature of life, death, and what might exist in the shadowy territory between. Sleep well, dear viewers, and perhaps tonight, check the locks on your doors with special care. After all, the Halberts, or whatever they have become, may still be out there somewhere, moving stiffly through the night, searching for new additions to their eternal family. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember, not all histories are meant to be unearthed, and some families keep secrets that should remain buried, even if they themselves never will be. But wait, before you go, I feel I should share one last detail with you. During the production of this episode, something unusual occurred. Several members of our research team reported receiving strange phone calls from an unlisted number. When answered, the caller remained silent for several seconds before speaking in what was described as a mechanical, halting voice. The message was always the same: we are still here. We are still together. Family is forever. Our technical team was unable to trace the calls, and we have no explanation for how the caller obtained the private numbers of our researchers. It may, of course, be nothing more than an elaborate prank by someone who learned of the episode's subject matter. Nevertheless, I've instructed my team to remain vigilant, and we've installed additional security measures at our studio. A simple precaution, nothing more. And with that, I truly will bid you good night. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's most disturbing family legacies. If the Halberts have taught us anything, it's that some traditions are best left in the past, and that sometimes letting go is the greatest act of love we can offer those who have passed on. Until our next exploration of the shadows where history and horror intersect, this is the Ghastly Journal, reminding you that the past is never truly dead, and sometimes, in the most literal sense, it refuses to be buried. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting our channel. Your contributions help us continue our research into history's darkest corners and bring these forgotten stories to light. And if you have suggestions for future episodes, or perhaps knowledge of other historical horrors you believe deserve exploration, we welcome your comments below. Now, I really must go. There's a strange car that's been parked outside the studio all evening, and I've just noticed that its occupants don't seem to be moving at all. Probably nothing to worry about, but in this line of work, one learns to be cautious. Good night, and remember, some family reunions are best avoided. As I conclude this tale, I find myself wondering about the nature of legends and how they evolve over time. The story of the Halberts, with its blend of historical elements and folklore embellishments, exemplifies how our deepest fears can take narrative form. Whether you view their story as a Gothic horror tale or a reflection on humanity's complex relationship with mortality, one thing remains certain: the idea of defying death's finality will continue to fascinate and disturb us in equal measure. Perhaps that's why the Halbert story endures. It speaks to something universal: our desire to hold on to those we love even when we know we should let them go. In their refusal to bury their dead, the Halberts represent an extreme manifestation of grief's denial stage, frozen in perpetuity. Modern medicine continues to push the boundaries of what constitutes death. Brain death, clinical death, cellular death. These terms suggest that dying is not a moment but a process. The line between life and what comes after grows ever more blurred. In this context, Magnus Halbert might be viewed not merely as a madman, but as a terrible pioneer, venturing into territories where science now treads with greater caution, but similar curiosity. What becomes of a family that cannot let go? What happens to love when it refuses to accept its natural conclusion? These are the questions at the heart of the Halbert saga, questions that remain relevant regardless of whether one believes in the literal truth of their story. And so I leave you with this final thought. The next time you find yourself unable to let go of something that has reached its natural end, be it a relationship, a phase of life, or even a loved one who has passed on, remember the Halberts. Remember that sometimes the most loving act is not preservation but release. Sometimes the most honorable thing we can do for our dead is to bury them properly and allow ourselves to move forward, carrying their memory rather than their physical remains. The Halberts never buried their dead, and in doing so, they may have lost something essential about what it means to be truly alive. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Good night, and may your own family traditions bring comfort rather than horror. I've just been handed a note by one of our producers. It seems we've received an unusual package at the studio. A small leather-bound journal with no return address. The accompanying note reads simply, "The last journal of Charlotte Halbert, continued." Inside is what appears to be aged parchment covered in faded handwriting. I'm told our team is currently verifying its authenticity, and if appropriate, we may share its contents in a future episode. Until then, sleep well, and remember to check under your bed for any family members who may have overstayed their welcome.